right, Internet, are we in a better place now to talk rationally about frame generation? Because I think when the technology first launched, there was overly negative reactions to it that were very widespread. But I also feel like as frame generation now is becoming more widely available through things like FSR3, allowing it to run on GPUs that aren't just Nvidia's 40 series, although, it's not the same frame generation technology, more on that later. With more Nvidia users and AMD users now able to look at and experience frame generation, have access to that, I think when I look at the comment sections now, it might even swing overly positive. And so I really think that we need to have a rational discussion about frame generation now that it's more widely available. Because I think, so why did we get such a negative reaction to it when it first launched? I think there's a couple of main reasons. Number one, because of how it was marketed. If it's marketed as just raw performance in a bar graph, putting it up, just those generated frame rate numbers up against non-generated frame rate numbers, then it's really is up to reviewers and people on the internet to make sure that there is pushback against that. Because, let me put it this way, if you're achieving 120 frames per second through frame generation versus achieving 120 frames per second through traditionally rendered frames by the game engine, you will not be achieving an equal experience. So just throwing the numbers out there in a bar graph is not really truthful. It's misleading. But because you then need to point out that the latency will be different in that experience, 120 generated frames versus 120 raw rendered traditional frames, not the same thing, not the same image quality, then you get a bunch of people lashing out against frame generation as it just adds latency and image artifacts, and so it's worthless, don't use it. And that is also completely unfair. So I think the way it was marketed lended itself to criticism, and but then that criticism on the internet, it's hard to take it rationally, have it be used rationally and responsibly by everyone. I know that may shock you that people on the internet can run with negativity. So the thing is, I think that there's there was a lot of people parroting things that they heard negative about frame generation before they'd ever actually experienced it, and in some ways that's a good thing, and in some ways that's a bad thing. I think now that more people have experienced frame generation, because one option, maybe they just have a 40 series GPU, right? I mean, a lot of this reviews were first coming out when only the 4090 existed that had frame generation, so very few people actually had experienced it. And then now it's now there's more affordable 40 series GPUs out there. More people have had a time to buy it. More people have experienced Nvidia's frame generation, and lately with AMD releasing frame generation, you are now having even more people have access to that. Not only AMD users, but people on Nvidia's 20 and 30 series and even earlier GPUs being able to experience this. Mods, now that AMD's FSR3 has gone open source, we're seeing mods that I've shown on the channel making 20 and 30 series users able to replace DLSS 3 frame generation with the actually compatible FSR3 frame generation in a bunch of games, with some mixed results, but when I look at the comments on those videos from people trying it out, they're overwhelmingly positive. And that's where I think we need to be careful now as well, which is it can be very exciting to see your frame rate number go up, but again, we need to still be mindful of what that means and if it's actually making your experience better. And in general, my reaction from the technology from the very beginning has been, it's a net positive in many situations. There are games where I'd rather have frame generation off. There are games where I would rather turn frame generation on, but having access to the feature is a good thing. And I think this is going to be a huge part of gaming technology moving forward. So I don't think this is going away. I think it's going to get better, and it's going to get more broad support, and it's going to expand. So let's talk a bit more about this. I think we should also talk about the fact that DLSS 3 frame generation and FSR 3 frame generation, are these technologies created equal? What's Intel going to be doing? There's a lot we need to talk about. So first of all, let's just jump back into why. So what are the downsides to frame generation? But now let's be rational about those things and not just run with them with overwhelming negativity, right? But we also need to rein in the overall, overly positive, feedback. So for example, I don't think frame generation is a great way to go from 40 frames per second to 60 frames per second. Now, some people I think actually will be happy with using it for that because we all perceive latency differently. We all perceive artifacts, image quality artifacts differently, and we all perceive motion fluidity differently. So different people are going to perceive this differently. But frame generation is at its best when you're already at a high base frame rate. Because it's interpolating to traditionally rendered images, right? So your game engine renders 2 images, and then it interpolates a guess at what should be happening in between them. And it's generally can be a very good quality guess. But there is a difference between those 2 traditionally rendered frames. And I'm going to try to stay away from real frame and fake frame when I'm discussing this because any frame of image that is displayed on your monitor is a real frame that your eyes see and help your perception of the game. But whether it's been traditionally rendered versus generated can again affect those frames, right? They're not of equal quality and they don't do exactly the same thing, right? But it's not fake versus real. I don't think that's the right word for it. Now, so the larger gap there is between the 2 traditionally rendered frames that are then being interpolated between, the more difficult it is to guess what is happening correctly in between them. And so the lower your overall frame rate is, the larger gaps there are between them. And so that makes it harder to generate a good frame in between. So there's more motion artifacts. In other words, the quality of the generated frames is lower, the lower your base frame rate is. And because the game engine is having to hold back showing you a real frame, I'm saying it again, a traditionally rendered frame in order to give it a chance to interpolate a generated frame, I think you can also get increased, latency, whereas if you just render more frames traditionally, you don't have to worry about the quality of them. And the more you get, the better the game becomes both more responsive and more fluid. So why would you want more frames in the first place? You want more frames generally for exactly 2 reasons. One reason is because it makes motion more smooth visually on your screen. And the other reason is because in traditionally rendered frames, it makes the game more responsive to your inputs. Generated frames help with one of those 2 things. They help the motion on your screen become more fluid. They do not help the game become more responsive to your inputs. In a competitive multiplayer situation, the main reason why you want the increased frame rate is to make the game more responsive to your input. So generated frames are not really going to help you in that situation. But in single player games, it's often more about the perception of the game, it looking good, and the way something looks in motion is highly relevant to how you are perceiving the game and how you're experiencing it. So increasing the number of frames presented per second, even if some of them aren't traditionally rendered, can greatly help your perception of the fluidity of the game. And as long as the game is responsive enough, and that is going to be different for everyone, how responsive is responsive enough? Again, everyone's going to perceive that differently and have a different set of standards. As long as you reach a certain base level of responsiveness, then it's going to be fine, and the increase to the perception of motion fluidity will be a good overall net benefit, as long as not too many image quality artifacts are introduced. So in general, for me, I've tried frame generation out in a ton of games, and you know, most with DLSS frame generation, so that's been around longer. But I've now tried it out in every game that supports. I've tried FSR3 frame generation in all the games that officially support it, as well as you know, I've now tried out some of the modding in frame generation. I've tried out AMD's fluid motion frames through its driver level, and all of that. So I've experienced a lot of frame generation. And my overall thought on it is similar to it was when I first reviewed it, when the RTX 4090 first launched. And I got pushback from some people that I was being too positive about it, and pushback from some people that I was being too negative about it. But in general, I still stand by my original opinion, which is it's overall a net positive to have the feature available, and in some games I'd rather turn it on, and in some games I'd rather turn it off. For example, I was recently playing Alan Wake 2 with DLSS 3 frame generation enabled initially. However, as the responsiveness was totally fine to me. The latency was not an issue whatsoever. For one thing, I was playing that game on a controller. I was actually sitting back on my couch playing it with a PS5 controller. It was turning on all the path tracing features and all of that. And initially, I was turning on frame generation. However, I got to a lot of scenes that were dark scenes with a flashlight. And as you turn, the edge of the flashlight beam, the kind of the circle of the flashlight, would have a lot of motion artifacts when frame generation was enabled. And again, this is gonna be a personal preference thing, but to my eye, it was incredibly distracting to the point where I preferred turning frame generation off, but using a more aggressive upscaling at the internal resolution. So I actually played at 4K DLSS performance mode, but then with frame generation turned off, because I just found the artifacts introduced by frame generation to be too distracting in that game. However, I've played through games like Plague Tale Requiem, where I was just like, oh yeah, definitely turn on frame generation. It is a much improved experience with it on. And I'm currently playing the Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty, path tracing features enabled and frame generation enabled. And I do think that is a net positive there, although I do occasionally on certain things see a bit of a garbling from the frame interpolation. It's just not as constant, and it's not as... I don't know, to me, it's just not as distracting to the overall experience as what I was seeing in Alan Wake 2, for example. And overall, again, feel like it's a net benefit to have it on. Now, again, there's different frame generation technologies out there. We have FSR3 frame generation now, and the version first introduced in Immortals of Avium and Forspoken is not quite as good as the version since then that has been introduced in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora and also in Like a Dragon, The Man Who Erased His Name. I've tried it out in both of those, and then now this version is now being modded into a whole bunch of games as well. Now, the newer version is certainly better than the original version in its frame pacing and its support of variable refresh rate displays. But I will tell you right now that I do still think that Nvidia's frame generation has a frame pacing advantage over AMD's frame generation when FSR3 can't just VSync lock to your monitor's max refresh rate. I think FSR3, again, its variable refresh rate support has improved. But in general, remember, what is the reason we're turning on these generated frames? They're not making your game more responsive. Their only purpose is to smooth out motion on your screen. That's why they exist. That's what they're doing, right? They don't have the traditional advantage of just rendering more traditional frames, right? So the only reason you turn these on is if it improves the motion fluidity of the action in your game, right? Well, I still find, after playing with it for a long time and playing a lot of Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, a bit of Like a Dragon, played some of the initial releases as well with Immortals of Avium and Forspoken to get a really good feel for FSR3, turning it on, turning it off, and especially in Immortals of Avium. I know it's the older version, but you do get the DLSS 3 and FSR3 in the same game, so for some side-by-sides. And I find that FSR3 frame generation, image quality-wise, can be very good. Frame pacing-wise, it's still not quite where DLSS is, I think, when you're not maxing out your monitor's refresh rate. I think that when FSR3 can max out the monitor's refresh rate and VSync lock to it, which can have a latency penalty, but I've generally felt that, to me at least, it feels fine when you're VSync locked to a high refresh rate display, like 120 FPS or more. That feels pretty good and looks very good with good frame pacing and image quality. When I'm more significantly below that, I think Digital Foundry's recent video on Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, I think, does a good job talking about this, where just like the pacing of the frames can just be a little bit off at times. Not all the time, and some scenes work better than others. But I felt like, again, when I was maxing out my monitor's refresh rate was when frame generation was at its best. With FSR3 specifically. I think DLSS still feels more like it just increases the fluidity, and I don't have to think so much about the frame pacing and if I'm VSync locked to the monitor's refresh window, that type of a thing. Anyway, but I still think FSR3 can be a better way to play a game. Again, even with the earlier version, with Immortals of Avium, I thought it was... when I could VSync lock to my monitor's refresh rate, I felt like it was better to have it on than have it off, which was good. Some of the biggest things can be HUD elements with Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. I'd rather turn it off, but that has less to do with the frame pacing, because again, I could usually just lock to my monitor's refresh rate most of the time and have it pacing-wise feel pretty good, and image quality-wise, the generated frames were fine other than how it interacted with the HUD element in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, where the HUD elements are generating at half refresh rate, but they have this large blurred area around them that can often be incredibly distracting when running at half refresh rate. And so that was my main issue in that game. So I want to see FSR3 in more games. I'd also like to see its frame pacing continue to improve, especially when you're in... when you're not VSync locked to your monitor's refresh rate. It's made some improvements already. I'd like to see that continue to get better. And then what about with the modded versions and things like that we're seeing here? So I recently tried out, RTX 30 series GPU getting FSR3 modded into Cyberpunk. And again, it can improve the frame pacing, although once again, I think it does have, like I said, it can be a bit hit or miss. So in a lot of scenes, it does improve things. But also, the modded versions aren't perfect. There can be some image quality artifacts. They're probably going to work better in some games than others. So I think it'll be best to wait and fully judge those until we get the official implementations. But with the comment section on those videos, I think a lot of people are finding that their perception of playing the game with FSR3 modded into it, they feel is better, right? But so... What am I really even getting at in this video? Well, what I'm trying to get at so far has been, I feel like the initial reaction to just screaming fake frames, saying it increases latency, so it's pointless, it's worthless, image quality artifacts, I think that is too negative. I think there are games where it's better to leave off, but I think there are definitely games where it's better to turn it on. But it is also important to note the differences between a frame rate achieved through generation versus a frame rate achieved natively. Or traditionally, however you want to call that, okay? But I think in many situations, it's better to have it on than to have it off. Now, let's talk about where I think the future of this stuff is going. So Intel has a very interesting piece of information out there called ExtraSS. This is different than DLSS 3 and FSR 3, which are frame interpolation techniques. Interpolation is taking two images that are either done or mostly done rendering in the game engine, using optical flow analysis, all sorts of things, and guessing what should have happened in between. From what we've seen so far of Intel's ExtraSS, it's talking about extrapolating a new frame. Extrapolation is different than interpolation. Extrapolation is guessing what the next frame should look like without having rendered a future frame to then generate in between, right? Now, this could have significant interesting implications. One is, well, that doesn't necessarily, I think, have to have a latency penalty, right? Because you're not having to necessarily hold back a frame in order to do this. But my biggest question will be the image quality. Can we actually get a good enough guess of what that future frame will look like? And then my other thought is, why can't it be both? Why can't you have extrapolated frames and interpolated frames? If you interpolate frames and you extrapolate frames, and also, what about the future of interpolating more than one frame? If you can guess an in-between frame between two traditionally rendered frames, why not guess 2 of them or 3 of them? And there's going to definitely be a frame time cost for trying to compute all of that. So I don't think we're there yet. But where do I think this technology is headed? I think that eventually the end goal with this type of technology will be to basically look at, okay, what is your monitor's maximum refresh rate? Whether that's 120, 240, 360, 500, 1000. I'm thinking future here, right? And basically take, okay, here's what your game can actually render traditionally, and then let's just fill in all the gaps. Why not fill in every gap? Why not take advantage of every single hertz your monitor is able to produce by filling it in with with some sort of actual frame, rather than just waiting or duplicating frames while you wait, right? And I think that's where this technology is headed. And I do think that eventually it seems reasonable that we could get to a point where that use case is actually well done, right? Now, I have more doubts about frame extrapolation, although that's certainly going to be interesting. But I think certainly interpolating more than one frame is definitely, I think, reasonable. If you can already do one, why not 2, right? And then in frame pacing wise, if you could get this perfectly synced up with your display's refresh rate, I think that's where this is all going. And I don't know how long it'll take to get there, but I think it's certainly interesting. And I think that in general, we are no longer in the era of traditionally rendering every frame being the default way that games are going to be played. I think while there will definitely still be people who just prefer to turn all of this off, turn off any upscaling techniques, turn off any frame generation techniques, I think they're going to generally become more and more of the minority as the quality of both upscaling and frame generation continue to improve. There's always the, work smarter, not harder kind of philosophy. So it's definitely, I think, we're reaching the case where it's like, does it make more sense to to generate frames and upscale frames than it does to traditionally render them? And there's definitely some trade-offs here. And I think where a lot of people are scared is that, or maybe pointing out is possibly already occurring, is what does that mean for game optimization? If game developers, can rely on these types of technologies to boost frame rates versus, more traditional optimization techniques. And I think that's a valid concern. And I think that, but I will say it's not like every game was super well optimized before these technologies existed. So we're also just in a transition point between moving from an older console generation to a newer console generation. So general PC hardware demands, I think, are kind of going up. But yeah, I think there can be a tendency to maybe take the easy way out, especially if publishers giving game devs only so much time to get this game out there, and we need to make some profit. I understand, and so that's something we need to keep an eye on. But in general, I think it's also just getting more confusing for gamers out there, right? You have to understand all of these technologies, and overall, I think in general, a lot of times you might be best off, turning off frame rate counters, turning off all of that, and just trying some of these things, especially with frame generation. Turn it on for a while, no frame rate counter. Just get a feel for what it's like with it on, get a feel for what it's like with it off, and decide which one felt better to you, right? Because a lot of times the increase in motion smoothness is going to be preferable. And I think especially when you're playing on a controller, because I can definitely say, like, a lot of games I prefer playing on a controller to mouse and keyboard. Other games I prefer playing with a mouse. And a mouse is such a one-to-one responsiveness thing that I think, whereas on a controller, I guess the latency just feels less noticeable to me. So When I'm playing with a controller, it's often going to be better to turn frame generation on. Although, like I said, Alan Wake 2, certain artifacts. Anyway, I feel like I'm just rambling at this point. I want to know your guys' thoughts in the comment section. Now that we've had more people have the ability to actually use frame generation, how do you feel about it? Honestly, do you rather have it on versus off? And in what games? Because for me, it's a game-by-game basis. And how do you feel about the future of all of this? Let me know. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.